Victoria Hayes pointed straight at Darius Coleman in front of the entire garage and said the words that stopped every wrench, every engine, every breath in that building. "You're done leading. Ryan runs this department now." Darius didn't yell, didn't beg. He picked up his toolbox, the one his uncle gave him at 17, and walked toward the door without a single word. That's when 14 men put their tools down at the exact same moment. No signal, no plan, no leader telling them what to do. Just silence, the most expensive silence Victoria Hayes would ever hear. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you're new here, subscribe and hit that bell. You will not want to miss what happens next. There are men who carry entire worlds on their shoulders, and nobody notices until the weight is gone. Darius Coleman was one of those men. He had been working at Horizon Fleet Solutions for 14 years, 8 months, and 11 days. Not that he counted. But if you asked anyone in that garage, the youngest apprentice sweeping the floor, or the oldest parts supplier who'd been delivering to Horizon, since before Darius arrived, they would give you that number with certainty. Because Darius Coleman's tenure wasn't just measured in time. It was measured in engines, saved in disasters, averted in the quiet, steady presence that kept a multi-million-dollar operation breathing when everything wanted to break down. At 35, he didn't look like what most people expected when they heard the words, lead mechanic. He wasn't tall in the way that made rooms quiet. He wasn't loud in the way that made people pay attention. He was medium height, solidly built, with hands that told the story of every hour he'd ever worked, scarred, calloused, oil-stained in the creases, no matter how hard he scrubbed. He kept his head low in conversations that didn't matter, and his eyes sharp in situations that did. He drove a 2009 Ford F-150 with a cracked dashboard and a heater that only worked on the driver's side. He ate his lunch, usually a sandwich his daughter helped pack the night before, sitting on a crate beside the East Bay doors, watching the lot, watching the trucks roll in, always thinking 3 steps ahead. That was Darius. Not flashy, not political, not interested in titles or recognition or the company newsletter. Just competent. Profoundly, uncomplicatedly, almost supernaturally competent. The garage at Horizon Fleet Solutions was a living thing. It had its own sounds, its own rhythms, its own moods. On a good day, you could hear the deep mechanical percussion of 8-10, sometimes 12 men, working in sync, impact wrenches, screaming hoists, groaning, the smell of hot metal and brake fluid hanging in the air like something permanent. On a bad day, the day a fleet of 18-wheelers needed to pass state inspection by morning, or the day a major client's entire delivery route collapsed because 3 trucks went down at once, the garage sounded different, tighter, more urgent. The voices got quieter, the movements got faster. On those days, everyone looked for Darius, not because he had the fanciest certifications framed on the wall, though he had several. Not because he was the loudest or the most aggressive, because he was neither. They looked for him because Darius Coleman had a gift that no certification could explain, and no management consultant could replicate. He could hear what was wrong, not figuratively, literally. He would walk up to an engine running rough and stand there with his eyes closed for 10-15 seconds, just listening. While other mechanics reached for their diagnostic laptops, Darius would already be reaching for a specific wrench. And 9 times out of 10, the other mechanics had stopped betting against it. He was right. Marcus Webb, who'd been at Horizon for 6 years, told this story to every new apprentice who walked through the bay doors. It was a Tuesday, maybe February, maybe March, one of those months that can't decide what it wants to be. We had this commercial refrigeration truck, belongs to one of our biggest clients' company that supplies restaurants all over the metro area. Truck comes in, engine running, no warning lights, driver says it just feels off. Like something's wrong, but he can't tell what. Marcus always paused here for effect. We put it on the diagnostic system. Nothing. Clean as a whistle. 3 guys look at it for 2 hours. Nothing. Then Darius walks over. He's in the middle of his own job across the bay, and he just stops. Tilts his head. Listens. Then he says, "Pull the secondary injector on cylinder 4. Just like that. No hesitation. We pull it. There's a hairline fracture so small you'd need magnification to see it. not triggering any codes yet. But another 100 miles, and that truck's engine would have locked up in the middle of a highway delivery. Probably would have taken the whole contract with it. Marcus always finished the same way. That's not a skill, that's something else. But the garage was only half of Darius Coleman's world. The other half was named Amara. His daughter was 8 years old with her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness. And she was the reason Darius Coleman woke up every single morning with something to prove. Her mother Janelle had left when Amara was 3. Not dramatically. No screaming, no ultimatums, no court battles. She had simply decided that the life Darius was building, honest, slow, rooted in unglamorous work, wasn't the life she wanted. She moved to Atlanta, remarried 2 years later, and called Amara on birthdays and occasionally on holidays. Darius never spoke badly about Janelle. Not to Amara, not to the guys at the garage, not to anyone. When Amara asked questions, he answered them with patience and just enough truth for her age. She loves you in her own way. People love differently, that's just life. But in the private chambers of his own heart, in the dark hours between putting Amara to bed and falling asleep himself, Darius carried a grief that he never named aloud. The grief of having to be everything to one small person. The grief of never being able to be half as good as she deserved. He had structured his entire life around her schedule. I was up at 5:15 every morning. Not because the garage demanded it, but because Amara needed breakfast before school, and he refused to let her eat cereal alone in front of the television like she didn't have a father who cared. He made eggs. Real eggs scrambled with cheese and a little bit of hot sauce on the side, because Amara had decided at age 6 that she liked things spicy, and Darius had found that endlessly funny, and never let her know how proud it made him. He dropped her at school at 7:40. He was at the garage by 8. He stayed until the work was done, sometimes 5, sometimes 8, sometimes past 10 on the brutal weeks. Then he picked Amara up from his neighbor Miss Gloria's house where she did homework and ate a second dinner and waited for her father without complaint, because even at 8 years old, Amara Coleman understood something about patience that most adults never learned. On weekends they worked on things together, small things. She handed him tools while he fixed the truck. She read to him while he cooked. They had a ritual on Sunday mornings. They walked to the corner bakery 2 blocks from their apartment, and Darius let her pick one thing, anything she wanted, and he paid for it with the $5 bill he kept folded in his left front pocket, specifically for that purpose. Those Sunday mornings were the best hours of his week. He would have gone to war for that girl without a second of hesitation. The racial weight that Darius carried was something he almost never discussed, but which shaped every professional interaction he had, in ways subtle and sometimes not subtle at all. He was a black man in a field that remained overwhelmingly white in a company whose upper management until recently had been entirely white, in a city where the gap between how black men were perceived and who they actually were remained one of the most exhausting distances in American life. He had learned to navigate it early. At his first automotive job at 19, a customer had handed his keys directly to the white apprentice standing next to Darius, despite the fact that Darius was wearing a shop shirt with his name on it, and the apprentice was holding a broom. He hadn't said anything that day. He'd finished the job, done it perfectly, and handed the keys back to the customer himself, watching the man's face cycle through surprise, and then an uncomfortable recalibration. Over the years, he had developed what his friend Deshaun called the tax. The extra work, the extra patience, the extra proof. The things you had to do and be and demonstrate simply to be considered roughly equivalent to someone who walked in the door carrying less suspicion. It was not bitterness that drove him. He had thought long and hard about bitterness and decided it was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not with Amara watching. Not with the mortgage on their apartment. Not with the guys at the garage who depended on him to hold things steady. But there were moments, quiet, private, unspoken moments, when the weight of all that extra proof pressed down on him so heavily that he had to sit in his truck in the parking lot for a few minutes before going inside just to find his center again. Just to remind himself why it was worth it. When Victoria Hayes bought Horizon Fleet Solutions, the purchase happened fast. The previous owner, a man named Gerald Adler, who had built the company from a 2-bay operation 30 years earlier, had died of a heart attack at 67. His estate sold to the first serious buyer. Victoria Hayes, 44, with a background in corporate logistics and a reputation for turning mid-size companies into scalable national brands, paid slightly above market value and took the keys in March. Darius had heard about the sale the same way everyone else did through Marcus, who heard it from the office manager, who had overheard a phone call she wasn't supposed to overhear. His initial response was measured. He had survived ownership changes before. The garage ran on skill and reputation, not on the name above the door. As long as the equipment was maintained and the clients were kept happy, a competent new owner should recognize what she had. He told Marcus exactly that. "We do our jobs. She sees the numbers. That's how this works." Marcus had looked at him for a long moment. "You really believe that?" "I have to." Victoria arrived on a Tuesday in April, unannounced, which Darius later recognized as her signature move. She liked to see operations before they were prepared for her. She walked the floor in heeled boots that made a sound against the concrete that none of them had heard in that garage before, flanked by a young man with a business school haircut and a jacket that cost more than some of Darius's monthly paychecks. Darius was elbow-deep in a transmission rebuild when she appeared at the edge of his workspace. He looked up, registered her presence, gave a brief nod, and went back to work. It was, he would later think, probably the wrong move. Not because it was disrespectful. It wasn't. It was the appropriate response of a professional to an unannounced interruption. But Victoria Hayes had spent her career in environments where people stopped what they were doing when she walked into a room. The fact that Darius didn't, that he evaluated her presence and determined that the transmission was more urgent, registered somewhere in her assessment of him as something other than what it was. She watched him for a few minutes before moving on. In those first weeks, Victoria held one-on-one meetings with every department head. When she got to the meeting lasted 45 minutes, the longest she'd spent with any of the floor staff. She asked smart questions. He gave her real answers. She asked about the fleet composition of their major clients. He walked her through it without notes. She asked about maintenance cycle bottlenecks. He described 3 specific choke points he'd been trying to get Adler to address for 2 years. She asked about staffing gaps in the apprenticeship pipeline. He had specific recommendations, specific names, specific timelines. She was impressed. He could see it. She wasn't the type who concealed her reactions entirely. There was a slight shift in her posture, a quality of attention that sharpened when he spoke precisely. At the end of the meeting, she said, "You clearly have deep institutional knowledge here, Darius. That's valuable. Thank you. I want to make sure that knowledge gets elevated properly as we grow." He had felt something like cautious optimism leaving that meeting. It seemed like she understood what he contributed. It seemed like she was the kind of owner who could see past surface impressions. He told Amara about it that night carefully without overselling it. "New boss seems sharp. Might be good." Amara looked up from her math homework. "Is she nice?" "She seems fair. That's better than nice." Amara considered that with the gravity of an 8-year-old processing a complicated piece of adult logic. "Okay. I hope she gives you a raise." Darius laughed, a real one, the kind that came from somewhere deeper than politeness. "Me too, baby. Me too." Ryan Hayes arrived 6 weeks after his aunt. He was 28. He had a business degree from a school whose name he dropped within the first 3 sentences of introducing himself. He wore clean clothes that were obviously wrong for a working garage. Not quite business casual. Not quite shop appropriate. Caught somewhere in the middle, in a way that suggested he'd tried to split the difference and missed both targets. How was not unintelligent. Darius recognized that quickly. Ryan could read a spreadsheet, organize a workflow, and speak the language of operational efficiency with fluency. In a conference room in front of a slide deck, he probably performed very well. In a garage, surrounded by machinery that required years of accumulated instinct to understand, he was a fish on dry land. And he knew it. That was the problem. Men who know they're out of their depth can go one of 2 ways. They can get humble, fast ask the right questions, and earn their way in. Or they can get defensive, try to compensate with authority they haven't earned, and make everyone around them miserable. Darius recognized which way Ryan was leaning within the first week. The first time he corrected Ryan gently professionally, while Ryan was explaining to a new apprentice an incorrect procedure for bleeding hydraulic brakes. Ryan's face went through a very specific sequence: surprise, embarrassment, recalibration. And then, underneath it all, something cold that Darius had seen before on the faces of men who confused their position with their worth. He didn't think much of it at the time. People reacted to correction differently. The good ones got over it. He told Marcus afterward, "He'll find his footing, just needs time." Marcus had given him that look again. The one that said he didn't share the optimism, but was too fond of Darius to say so directly. The dynamic shifted in ways that were small at first, and then accelerating. Ryan began sitting in on client calls that had traditionally been handled by Darius and the operations coordinator, a woman named Patricia, who had been at Horizon for 9 years. That was fine. Learning was fine. But Ryan started speaking in those calls as though he had the expertise to back up the assertions he was making. He promised turnaround times that weren't realistic. He described capabilities that required qualification. When the clients pushed back, he deferred to Darius, but in a way that made Darius the support rather than the source. Darius adjusted. He could work within uncomfortable dynamics. He'd been doing it his whole career. Then Ryan started coming to Victoria with problems he hadn't first tried to solve. It happened with the Jensen trucking contract, one of Horizon's largest. Jensen had a fleet of 42 vehicles and a maintenance schedule that Darius had designed personally, a system that had cut their downtime by 30% over 2 years. Ryan had presented a modification to that schedule at a meeting Darius wasn't invited to attend. Darius found out afterward from Patricia in the parking lot. "He changed your schedule." "Which part?" "The inspection intervals on the refrigerated units. He said the current schedule was inefficient." Darius was quiet for a long moment. "He shortened the intervals or lengthened them." Lengthened. He said it would save on labor costs. Those units run through temperature fluctuations that stress specific seal components every single day. The inspection intervals are what they are because I've watched 2 of those compressor seals fail in the last 3 years. The labor cost of the inspection is about 8% of the cost of a roadside failure and a spoiled load. Patricia looked at him steadily. "You need to talk to Victoria." "I will." I went to Victoria that afternoon. Professionally. With data. With the maintenance records and the cost analysis and the failure history. He laid it out on her desk with the same calm precision he brought to every problem. Victoria listened. She nodded in the right places. Then she said, "Ryan is going to be taking on a broader operational role here, Darius. I want you to support that transition. I'm not against Ryan taking on more responsibility. I'm telling you this specific decision has a high probability of generating a costly failure. I'll take that under advisement." "Victoria." "I said I'll take it under advisement." He drove home that night with his jaw clenched and his hands tight on the wheel. He picked up Amara from Miss Gloria's. He made dinner. He helped with her homework. He listened to her talk about a girl at school named Priya, who had become her new best friend, and who had the best erasers she had ever seen. Erasers shaped like tiny food items, and wasn't that amazing? "Daddy, wasn't that the most amazing thing?" "That's pretty amazing," he said. And he meant it. Because she could still be amazed by tiny food-shaped erasers. Because her world was still that whole, and that safe. He held on to that. 3 weeks later, one of the Jensen refrigerated units failed on I-40. Seal failure. Compressor locked up. $14,000 in spoiled product. The driver had to wait 4 hours for a tow. Jensen's operations manager called Horizon furious. The call went to Ryan. Ryan tried to handle it. The operations manager demanded to speak to whoever had been running their maintenance program. Darius took the call. How was honest with Jensen. He explained what had happened, acknowledged the failure, and outlined exactly what he would do to prevent it from happening again. He did not throw Ryan under the bus. He did not explain the internal politics that had led to the changed interval. He simply fixed it. Professionally. at his own expense of an evening spent rewriting the maintenance schedule and hand-delivering it to Jensen's fleet manager the following morning. Jensen renewed their contract 6 weeks later, specifically according to Patricia, because of that meeting. Victoria said nothing to Darius about the renewal. Ryan said nothing to Darius about the failure he had caused. The morning. It happened. The morning that changed everything. Started like every other morning. Darius was at the stove at 5:15. Eggs with cheese. Hot sauce on the side. Amara at the kitchen table with her backpack already on because she liked to be ready before she needed to be a habit. She'd picked up from watching her father. "Daddy, can we do the bakery on Saturday instead of Sunday this week? Priya's coming over Sunday." "Saturday's fine. And can we get the thing with the chocolate on top? The croissant. The chocolate one." "Chocolate croissant." "Yeah." "Saturday. Chocolate croissant. Done." She grinned. He slid the eggs onto her plate. He dropped her at school. He drove to the garage. He pulled into his usual spot in the back lot, cut the engine, and sat for exactly 30 seconds, his ritual just breathing. Centering. Getting ready to be who the day was going to need him to be. Then he went inside. Patricia was standing at the door to the service bay. She had a specific expression on her face, the one she wore when something had happened that she didn't know how to say. "There's a meeting," she said. "Main bay," Victoria called it. "Everybody." "When?" 8 o'clock, 10 minutes. He looked at her face more carefully. "What's it about?" She didn't answer. She just looked at him, and in that look was something that felt like an apology for something she hadn't done. He went inside. Sure. The main bay cleared of equipment. 14 mechanics, 3 apprentices, Patricia, and 3 office staff crowded into the space around the center lift. Victoria stood in front of them in a charcoal blazer. Ryan stood 2 steps behind her and to her right. He was looking at the floor. Darius stood near his toolbox, arms loose at his sides, face neutral. He already knew. He didn't know how he knew, but he knew. Victoria spoke for 3 minutes. She talked about Horizon's growth trajectory. She talked about operational restructuring. She talked about aligning leadership with the company's future vision. And then she said the words. Ryan Hayes would assume leadership of the maintenance department effective immediately, with full authority over scheduling, staffing decisions, and workflow management. Darius would continue in his role as senior mechanic. Reporting to Ryan. The bay was absolutely silent. Not the comfortable silence of men focused on work. The tight, pressurized silence of a room full of people who had just heard something that violated a principle they hadn't known they held until the moment it was broken. Darius felt the silence more than he felt the words. He felt the silence from Marcus, who was standing 8 feet to his left and had stopped breathing. He felt it from Jerome, the youngest mechanic, who was 23, and had specifically chosen Horizon because of Darius's reputation, and had once told Darius privately that the day he worked in this garage was the day he'd finally felt like someone believed he could be great. He felt it from Patricia, who was standing near the door with her clipboard pressed against her chest like a shield. Victoria finished speaking. Nobody moved. Then Darius said very quietly, very evenly, "After 14 years, after everything I've built here, was my experience never enough?" Victoria looked at him. Something moved across her face, not quite guilt, not quite discomfort, and then was gone. "Darius, this is a business decision. It's not personal." "I understand." "Ryan brings a different set of skills that align with where we're—" "I understand, Victoria." I didn't say anything else. He turned toward his locker. He took out his personal toolbox, the one he'd owned since before Horizon. The snap-on set his uncle had given him when he was 17, the one thing he never left behind, regardless of where he worked. He set it on the dolly beside his station. He took his jacket off the hook. He folded it over his arm. The bay was still silent. He started walking toward the door. He had almost reached it when Marcus Webb's impact wrench went silent. Darius stopped. Behind him, he heard the sound of another tool going down. A ratchet. Then a socket set. Then the unmistakable sound of a pneumatic hose being disconnected from a lift. He turned around. Marcus had stepped back from his work. His arms were at his sides. He wasn't looking at Victoria. He was looking at Darius with an expression that was not anger and not grief, but something older and more complicated than either. Jerome had stopped. The two apprentices at the far end of the bay had stopped. Tony, who was 51 and had worked at Horizon for 11 years and almost never talked about anything except college football, and his grandchildren, had set down his torque wrench and was standing completely still. One by one, quietly, without theatrics. They stopped. And then Marcus Webb said something that Darius would carry with him for the rest of his life. "We're not leaving because you lost a title, D." His voice was steady. No performance in it, just truth. "We're leaving because the company forgot what you gave us." Darius looked at them, all of them, these men he'd trained and protected and stood beside and argued with and covered for and believed in when they didn't believe in themselves. And something happened in his chest that he didn't have a name for and couldn't have described to anyone, even if he'd tried. "Don't," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "You have families. You have mortgages. Don't do this." "Already done." That was Tony. Quiet and final, the way Tony said everything. "You'll lose your jobs. Victoria has the authority." "We know what she has the authority to do," Marcus said. "We're choosing what we have the authority to do." Darius looked at Victoria. She was standing very still. The expression on her face was something he hadn't seen from her before. She had been an owner for 4 months. In those 4 months, she had always had the room. She didn't have it anymore. Ryan was looking at the floor again. Darius turned back to his team. "I need you to understand something," he said. "Whatever you choose, I respect it. But I'm not asking you to do this. I'm not leading this." "We know," Jerome said. And at 23, with his whole career ahead of him, he sounded steadier than anyone in that room had a right to sound. "That's why we're doing it." Darius stood there for one long moment. Then he picked up his toolbox, and he walked out the door. Behind him, in the silence of that garage, 14 men stayed exactly where they were. Not shouting, not threatening, not performing for anyone, just standing. The most expensive silence in the history of Horizon Fleet Solutions had just begun. He sat in his truck in the back lot for a long time. He didn't call anyone. He didn't text. He just sat there with his hands on the wheel and the engine off and the morning still and cold around him. He thought about his uncle handing him that toolbox at 17 and saying, "Whatever you do, do it so well they can't pretend you weren't there." He thought about Amara's face that morning over her eggs, the chocolate croissant on Saturday, Priya's food-shaped erasers. I thought about 14 years of early mornings and stayed late evenings and problems solved and disasters prevented and men trained and clients kept and work done, always, always the work done, and how all of that could be set aside with a 3-minute speech in a garage by a woman who had owned the place for 4 months. He thought about the look on Marcus's face. "We're leaving because the company forgot what you gave us." He closed his eyes. He sat there until he was ready. Then he drove home. He had a chocolate croissant to plan for on Saturday, and a daughter who was going to come home at 3:15, expecting her father to be okay. He was going to be okay. But the garage. The garage had just gone dark, in ways Victoria Hayes was only beginning to understand. The parking lot of Horizon Fleet Solutions had never been that quiet at 8:15 in the morning. Usually by this hour, the bay doors were all the way up. The compressors were running, and you could hear the operation from the street, that steady industrial heartbeat that meant work was happening. Contracts were being honored. Clients were being served. It was the sound of a functioning business, and Victoria Hayes had come to take it for granted, the way you take for granted a heartbeat. You only notice it when it stops. It had stopped. She stood at the window of her office on the 2nd floor and looked down at the main bay, and what she saw made something cold move through her chest. The lifts were up, but empty. The tools were laid out on the workbenches exactly where they'd been set down, not put away, not organized, just set down mid-task, as though the men who'd been holding them had simply evaporated. A transmission rebuild sat half-finished on the center lift. An air filter replacement sat open on the secondary bench. A fleet inspection checklist sat on the hood of a delivery truck with a pen lying across it at an angle as though it had been dropped rather than placed. 14 mechanics. Gone. Ryan was standing in the middle of the bay floor, looking at all of it like a man who had just walked into a room where something terrible had happened and couldn't quite locate the source of the smell. He was holding his tablet. He wasn't using it. He was just holding it because holding something gave his hands a purpose that the situation had otherwise removed from him entirely. Victoria came down the stairs fast. "Where are they?" Ryan turned. The confidence he'd walked in with that morning, the pressed clothes, the straight posture, the air of a man who had just been given something he believed he deserved, had drained out of him almost completely. They left. All of them. They put everything down and walked out. I told them they were making a serious mistake. I told them this was insubordination. They didn't. He stopped, swallowed. They didn't even look at me. Victoria walked the length of the bay. She looked at the half-finished transmission. She looked at the open checklist. She looked at the row of personal coffee cups still sitting on the shelf above the secondary bench. Each one belonging to a specific man, each one left behind because the men who owned them had not planned to be gone long enough to need them. Or because they didn't care about the cups. Or because leaving them behind was its own kind of message. She pulled out her phone and called Darius. It rang 4 times, then voicemail. She called again. 4 rings. Voicemail. She texted Darius. "Call me immediately. This has gone far enough." She stared at the screen for 30 seconds. No response. Ryan was watching her. "I can try to reach some of the other guys. Marcus Webb. I have his number from the contact sheet." Marcus walked out first, Victoria said without looking up. "Calling Marcus is not going to accomplish what you think it will." "So what do we do?" She finally looked at him. And in that moment, for just a fraction of a second, Victoria Hayes allowed herself to see her nephew without the architecture of her own hopes built around him. Not the business degree, not the potential, not the family investment, not the vision she'd had of Ryan growing into this company the way she'd planned. Just the man standing in front of her in a garage he didn't know how to run, holding a tablet that couldn't tell him a single useful thing about the situation he was in. Then the moment passed, and she was the CEO again. "Get Patricia on the phone. Find out what contracts have active vehicles we're legally obligated to service today. We need to know exactly what we're looking at before we do anything else." Ryan nodded and moved toward the office stairs. Victoria stood alone in the empty bay. She looked at the half-finished transmission on the center lift. She didn't know enough about transmissions to know how critical that particular stage of the rebuild was, or whether leaving it in that state overnight would damage the work already done, or whether it could safely wait. She didn't know which client the truck belonged to, or what the deadline was, or whether there was any flexibility. She had been running this company for 4 months, and there was an entire dimension of it she had never learned because she had assumed the man who knew it would always be there. She stood very still in the empty bay. And for the first time since she'd bought Horizon Fleet Solutions, Victoria Hayes felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt the specific cold weight of a mistake she could not immediately fix. Patricia Okafor had worked at Horizon for 9 years. She had outlasted 2 ownership changes, economic recession, and a period 3 years back when the company had come within 60 days of losing its largest client due to a scheduling collapse that Darius Coleman had personally prevented by working 36 hours straight across 2 days. She kept track of everything, forgot nothing, and had a way of delivering information that made it impossible for you to pretend you hadn't understood. When Ryan found her in the office, she already had the contract schedule pulled up on her monitor. "We have 4 active service obligations today," she said without turning around. Jensen Trucking has 2 vehicles that are mid-inspection. Harbor Freight Logistics has a scheduled preventive maintenance visit at their depot. At 2 o'clock, they'll have 6 vehicles waiting. Metro Delivery has a breakdown situation on I-40 trucks been on the shoulder since 7:40 this morning. Driver's been waiting for dispatch confirmation for over an hour. And Consolidated Regional has their monthly fleet review at 4. Ryan stood in the doorway. "Okay, so we need to..." "Ryan." Patricia turned around. Her voice was not unkind, but it was not soft either. The Jensen inspection requires someone who knows the specific maintenance history of those two vehicles. The Harbor Freight visit requires someone familiar with their fleet agreement, which has 17 custom provisions. Darius negotiated personally. The Metro breakdown is a refrigerated unit on a state highway, which means liability exposure if it's not resolved correctly and quickly. And Consolidated's fleet review has to be led by someone they trust. She let that sit for a moment. Darius was supposed to handle all 4 of those today. Those aren't tasks you can hand off to someone else on 2 hours' notice because there isn't anyone else. That's what walking out means. Victoria is the CEO. Victoria can't rebuild a transmission. I can't bleed hydraulic brakes. She stopped herself. Ryan looked at her steadily. Say it. I was going to say that we all have limitations. The question is, what we do with them. She turned back to her monitor. Metro Delivery's driver has been sitting on the shoulder of I-40 for 90 minutes. His name is Calvin. He has a cooler full of medication samples that have a temperature window. You might want to start there. Marcus Webb lived 12 minutes from the garage in a neighborhood of small houses with narrow driveways and basketball hoops mounted above garages. He was sitting on his front steps when Darius pulled up that afternoon, as though he'd been expecting him. Maybe he had. They knew each other well enough that neither of them needed the other to announce himself. Darius sat down next to him. Neither of them said anything for a full minute. Then Marcus said, "You eat anything today?" "Not really." "LaShonda made a pot of chili. Come inside." "In a minute." Darius looked at his hands. "You shouldn't have done it, Mark. I know that's what you think. You have 3 kids. You have a mortgage. If Victoria decides to treat this as a walkout and not a protest, then she decides that." Marcus's voice was even. "That's on her. We made our choice. You don't get to carry that for us too." "It's not carrying it. It's just D." Marcus waited until Darius looked at him. "Do you know what you did for Jerome?" Darius didn't say anything. When Jerome started, you remember, he came in scared out of his mind. Barely said 10 words in his first 2 weeks. Remember why? He'd been let go from his previous shop. He'd been let go from his previous shop after 2 years, Marcus said. 2 years. And the reason they gave him, the reason they put in writing, was that he lacked the aptitude. 22 years old. 2 years of work. And somebody put in writing that he lacked the aptitude. He paused. "You know what you told him first real conversation you had with him?" Darius shook his head slightly. "You told him that aptitude was a word people used when they didn't want to admit they hadn't taught someone correctly. You told him you were going to teach him correctly, and then we'd see about aptitude." Marcus let out a short breath. "Kid cried in his car after that. He told me that 6 months later. Said he cried because he hadn't realized until that moment how much he'd believed what they'd written about him." The street was quiet. A dog barked somewhere 2 houses over and then stopped. "Jerome's not walking out because of a title," Marcus said. "None of us are. We're walking out because the person who saw us, who actually saw us, not just our labor, just got told he wasn't worth keeping." Darius looked at the street. "I begged them not to," he said, quietly. "Inside. I told them, I said, don't do this." "I know you did. I meant it. I know you meant it too." Marcus stood up. "Doesn't change anything. Come eat some chili." Darius sat there another moment. Then he stood up. "Can I call Amara from inside? I told her I'd call before 5. You know where the phone is." They went inside. By noon, the consequences had started arriving. Metro Delivery's driver Calvin was still on the shoulder of I-40. Victoria had tried to arrange outside service through a mobile repair vendor, their insurance used for emergencies, but the vendor was 40 minutes out and not certified to service the specific refrigeration unit in Calvin's truck. The medication samples inside the cooler had a 6-hour temperature window from when the unit failed. That window was now at 4 hours and counting. Patricia had called the client. The client's operations manager had called Victoria directly. "I need to understand what's happening over there," the operations manager said. His voice had the particular quality of a man who was controlling his anger through a filter of professionalism, but just barely. We have had a standing service agreement with Horizon for 3 years. In 3 years, we have never had a response time beyond 90 minutes for a breakdown situation. I understand, and I want to assure you that we are. My driver has been on the side of a highway for 2.5 hours. The medication in that unit is bound for 4 hospitals in the metro area. If we lose this load, that is a liability conversation that goes significantly beyond this phone call. Victoria closed her eyes briefly. We are resolving this as quickly as possible. I'd like to speak with Darius Coleman. The sentence landed like something physical. Darius is not, he's not available. That's unusual. In 3 years, Darius has always been the point of contact for our service issues. Is he ill? He's not currently there. Have been some internal staffing changes. Staffing changes. The operations manager's voice shifted. Got quieter, which was worse. What kind of staffing changes? Victoria didn't answer immediately. And in that pause, that 2-second hesitation, the operations manager heard everything he needed to hear. I see, he said. Please have someone from your leadership team call me within the hour. We'll need to discuss the terms of our contract going forward. The call ended. Victoria set the phone down on her desk and sat very still. Ryan was in the doorway. He had been listening. I can call some staffing agencies, he said. Get some temporary mechanics in. Temporary mechanics won't know our clients' fleets. They won't know the maintenance histories. They won't know the custom provisions in the service agreements. They won't know which client needs to be handled which way or what a breakdown on I-40 means versus a breakdown at a depot versus a breakdown at a client's facility. She was speaking more to herself than to him. This isn't just labor. This is institutional knowledge. 14 years of institutional knowledge just walked out that door. Ryan was quiet. I thought we could manage without... Without what? She looked at him directly. Without Darius. Is that what you were going to say? He didn't answer. Ryan, I need you to be honest with me. Right now in this room, how much of what this department does every day did you actually understand before this morning? The silence stretched. I understood the operational framework, he said finally. The workflow structure, the efficiency model. I could see where the process improvements were. That's not what I asked you. Another silence. Longer. No, he said. Not all of it. Not no. Victoria nodded slowly. She picked her phone back up and tried Darius again. 4 rings. Voicemail. Jerome Watkins was 23 years old and had wanted to be a mechanic since he was 9, when his grandfather had let him sit on a stool in his home garage and hand him tools while he worked on an old Buick that was always breaking down and somehow never got sold. His grandfather had a patience about machinery that Jerome had never seen in any other adult, a willingness to take something apart, completely understand every piece of it, and put it back together better than it was. Jerome had spent 2 years at his first shop being told in every way, except explicitly, that he didn't belong. Not a single person had ever sat next to him and explained why something worked the way it worked. They handed him tasks and graded his completion. They never taught him anything. Then he'd come to Horizon. I was sitting in Marcus's living room now on the couch eating chili out of a bowl, listening to Marcus and Darius talk at the kitchen table. I wasn't part of the conversation. He was just there the way young men sometimes needed to be near older men. They respected when things got serious, not to participate but to witness. He heard Darius say, "What I keep thinking about is what happens to the guys who needed this job most. Tony's got a kid in college. That tuition doesn't stop coming because we made a statement." Marcus, Tony knew that when he put his wrench down. That doesn't make me feel better about it. It's not supposed to make you feel better. It's supposed to make you understand what it meant to him to do it anyway. Jerome stared into his bowl. I thought about what Darius had told him 11 months ago about the word aptitude. He had in fact cried in his car. He hadn't told Marcus that Marcus must have pieced it together from something else. He had sat in his car in the Horizon parking lot after that first real conversation with Darius, and felt something in his chest crack open that had been sealed shut for 2 years. Not because Darius had said anything miraculous. Not because it was some great speech. Because Darius had said it like he meant it. Like it was obvious. Like Jerome's potential was simply a fact that needed acknowledging, rather than a charity being extended. He'd never experienced that before. From a boss. From a superior. From a man who had the authority to evaluate him. He set his bowl down and looked across the room at Darius. "Can I say something?" Both men looked at him. "I know you didn't want us to walk out. I know you think we're risking too much. And maybe we are." He stopped for a second. "But I have been at 2 shops before Horizon. And at both of them, I watched the people in charge make decisions that hurt the people who didn't have enough power to push back. And everybody saw it. And nobody did anything. And I watched it happen, and I didn't do anything." He looked at Darius steadily. "I'm not doing that again. Whatever it costs me. I'm not watching that happen again and doing nothing." The kitchen was quiet. Darius looked at this young man, 23 years old, his whole career still ahead of him, risking it for a principle, and felt that unnamed thing in his chest again, heavier this time. "Jerome. I know the risks. I'm not being naive." Jerome picked his bowl back up. "I just wanted you to know why." At 2:40 in the afternoon, Ryan Hayes walked into an empty service bay, rolled up his sleeves and opened a laptop. He pulled up every maintenance manual he could find for the specific vehicles in Horizon's active fleet. He found the Jensen trucking file, the one that was supposed to be inspected today, and started reading through the service history. He read for 20 minutes before he understood what he was looking at. The service history was meticulous. Every entry dated, detailed, cross-referenced. Engine behavior notes written in plain language that described patterns across time. Not just what had been done, but why, and what to watch for afterward. Seal wear patterns on the refrigerated units tracked across 3 years with specific mileage correlations. Brake wear patterns on the heavy haul vehicles broken down by driver behavior. Tire rotation logs that accounted for the specific load distribution of Jensen's most common cargo configurations. It was not just a maintenance record. It was a living document. An ongoing conversation between a mechanic and a fleet of machines across years, written in the margins of standard forms and handwriting that was careful and precise, and Ryan noticed with something that felt like discomfort. Clearly the product of a man who had been thinking about these vehicles constantly, not just when they were in front of him. He turned to the Harbor Freight Logistics file. Same thing. He turned to Metro Delivery. Same thing. He sat back in the chair. He thought about the morning he'd arrived at Horizon, the confidence he'd felt walking in with his aunt. The sense that this place was a system waiting to be optimized, that the inefficiencies he could see from the outside would yield to the kind of organized, structured thinking his education had trained him for. He thought about the way Darius had looked at him in those first weeks. Not dismissively, not resentfully, just carefully. The way you look at something you're not sure about yet. He thought about the meeting where he'd changed the Jensen maintenance intervals. The way he'd presented it as an efficiency improvement. The way it had seemed on a spreadsheet like a straightforward cost reduction. The way he'd felt presenting it competent, useful, contributing. He thought about the seal that had failed 3 weeks later. He thought about Darius taking the call from Jensen's operations manager. The way he'd handled it, not just professionally, but humanely. Not throwing anyone under the bus. Not explaining the internal politics, just fixing it. Ryan had been in the building when that call happened. He had been close enough to the office to hear Darius's side of it. He had told himself it was fine. He had told himself it was just one failure, and the correction was already in place. He had not once thought to apologize. He stared at the maintenance records for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and did something he hadn't done in a long time. He called his aunt. She answered on the first ring. "Ryan, I've been reading his files." A pause. "Darius's maintenance records. All of them, for every major client." He stopped. "I need to ask you something and I need you to answer me honestly." "Okay." When you decided to make me department head, was there any version of this where I was actually qualified to do what he does? The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that it answered the question before Victoria said a word. You have skills that... Not what I asked. Another pause. No, Victoria said quietly. Not for the technical side. I thought... She stopped. I thought the technical side could be managed with support. I thought your operational skills and his technical expertise could coexist in a... You thought I could have the title and he'd still do the work. She didn't answer. That's what you thought, isn't it? You thought you could put me above him and he'd stay because he always stayed. Because he's always been the one who stayed. The silence stretched. Ryan. I'm sitting in the bay reading 14 years of his work, Ryan said. His voice was quiet, but there was something underneath it. Not anger exactly, but something honest that Ryan Hayes hadn't let himself be in a very long time. And I need you to understand something. This man didn't just keep your company running. He built something in here. These records aren't just maintenance logs. He was thinking about these machines constantly. He was thinking about the clients constantly. He was thinking about the guys constantly. He paused. He was doing the work of 3 people and getting paid like one, and you gave me the title over him because my name is Hayes. The line was quiet. I need to fix this, Victoria said finally. I know. I don't know if he'll come back. I know that too. Ryan looked at the open maintenance file on the laptop in front of him, at the handwriting in the margins, at the years of careful, consistent, unseen work, written in neat columns and personal notes and small diagrams that showed how a man thought about his work when nobody was grading him on it. I need to talk to him, Ryan said. He's not answering my calls. He doesn't need to answer yours. Ryan stood up. I know where to start. Darius was in his driveway at 6:15 under his truck. Not because anything was wrong with it. Because when things got heavy in his mind, physical work was the only thing that moved them. He'd been doing it since he was 17. Put your hands on something real. Focus on what's in front of you. Let the noise settle. He heard a car pull up. He heard footsteps on the driveway. He slid out from under the truck and found Ryan Hayes standing there in his work-inappropriate clothes, hands in his jacket pockets, looking like a man who had rehearsed several versions of this conversation and abandoned all of them on the drive over. Darius sat up, wiped his hands on a rag. He waited. Ryan opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. I read your files today. Darius didn't say anything. All of them. The Jensen file, Harbor Freight, Metro Consolidated. I read them all. Ryan's jaw moved. I've been at Horizon for 6 weeks. I changed a maintenance interval based on a spreadsheet analysis without talking to you. Without understanding why the interval was what it was. Without... He stopped. The seal that failed on the Metro unit. That was my decision. You fixed it. You went to Jensen's fleet manager personally, and I never said a word to you about it. Darius looked at him steadily. Why are you here, Ryan? Because I needed to say that to your face. Not in a meeting. Not in front of my aunt. To your face. Okay. You said it. Ryan met his eyes. I had the degree and the last name and I walked in there like that was enough. Like 14 years of what you built was just existing infrastructure that I could walk into and reorganize. He shook his head. I didn't see you. I didn't see any of them. I saw a department I was being handed. A silence. The evening had gone blue around the edges. From inside the house, faint and warm, came the sound of a television. Amara's, probably the animated shows she watched after dinner with the volume turned up just slightly too high because she got absorbed in them and forgot to adjust. Darius looked at his hands, at the oil that never quite came out of the creases. I'm not looking for an apology, he said finally. I know. I'm not offering one to get something from you. I just... Ryan stopped, found the words. I needed you to know that I understand what I did. Not what happened to the company. What I did to you. The sound of the TV from inside the house. Darius was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Go home, Ryan. Get some sleep. Ryan nodded, turned to go. And Ryan. He turned back. Those notes in the Jensen file, the ones about the sealware on the compressor units. Read them again, slowly. Not for information. Read them to understand how someone thinks about a problem across time. Ryan stood there. That's the difference between a job and a craft, Darius said. A job is what you do when you're there. A craft is what you're thinking about when you're not. Ryan looked at him for a long moment. Then he walked back to his car. Darius watched him go. Then he reached for the truck again, slid back underneath it, and put his hands on something real. The night settled around him. Somewhere inside the house, Amara turned the TV up just slightly too high, the way she always did. And Darius Coleman in the driveway of his house kept working. Ryan drove home that night with both hands on the wheel and nothing on the radio. He kept thinking about what Darius had said. Not the words exactly the way he'd said them. Flat and even, without anger, without the satisfaction that Ryan had half expected and maybe half deserved. Like a man explaining something simple to someone who should have understood it a long time ago. Like a man who had already processed his own grief and come out the other side carrying something heavier and quieter than resentment. A job is what you do when you're there. A craft is what you're thinking about when you're not. Ryan pulled into his apartment complex, cut the engine, and sat in the dark for a long time. He thought about the business school professor who had told his graduating class that leadership was about vision. About seeing the system from above, identifying inefficiencies, implementing solutions. Ryan had written that down in his notebook. He had believed it completely. He had never once heard anyone in that building talk about what it meant to listen to an engine. To know a machine across years. To carry 14 clients' worth of mechanical history in your head, because you understood that forgetting a detail wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a failure of care toward a person whose livelihood depended on a vehicle running right. He went inside. He sat at his kitchen table. He opened his laptop and pulled up the Jensen file again. He read it for 2 hours. Not for information this time. To understand how someone thinks about a problem across time. Victoria Hayes did not sleep well. She lay in her hotel room. She'd been staying at a business hotel near the facility while she looked for a permanent place. One of those decisions she'd kept pushing back because there was always something more urgent, and she stared at the ceiling and ran the day through her mind like a film she was trying to find the mistake in before it reached an audience. 14 mechanics. 4 active client obligations missed or severely compromised. 1 operations manager who had asked for Darius Coleman by name and heard the hesitation in her voice. 1 nephew sitting in an empty bay reading maintenance files. 1 man who had not answered a single one of her calls. She thought about the 45-minute meeting she'd had with Darius 2 weeks after buying Horizon. She thought about how sharp he'd been, how prepared, how he'd described the bottlenecks in the maintenance pipeline without notes from memory, in a way that told her he was living inside this operation 24 hours a day. She thought about how she'd left that meeting thinking he's valuable. And then she thought about how that word valuable had remained in her head as a category rather than a recognition. Valuable like a piece of equipment. Valuable like infrastructure. Not valuable the way you're valuable when someone actually sees you. She reached over and picked up her phone. Looked at the text she'd sent Darius that morning. "Call me immediately. This has gone far enough." She read it again. She put the phone face down on the nightstand. This has gone far enough. As though the problem were his reaction, not her decision. As though the 14 men standing still in the bay were the disruption and not the thing that had caused them to stand still. She thought about her father, who had started a small HVAC company and run it for 30 years on the principle that the people who worked with their hands were the real infrastructure of any business. He used to say that a company was only as good as the person you called at midnight when something broke. He meant it as a business principle. He had never meant it as a compliment to the person doing the calling at midnight. She wondered in the dark when she had stopped hearing the difference. She sat up, turned on the lamp, picked up the pad of paper she kept on the nightstand for exactly these hours. The hours when her mind refused to stop working, and the only way through was to write. She wrote one question at the top of the page. What did I actually see when I looked at Darius Coleman? She sat with that question for a long time. Then she started writing the answer. Honestly. The kind of honest that only works when nobody else is reading. She wrote for 40 minutes. When she was done, she put the pen down and read what she'd written. It was not comfortable reading. The second day without mechanics was worse than the first. The phone calls started at 7:40 in the morning, before Patricia had even gotten her coffee from the machine in the break room. Harbor Freight Logistics, whose preventive maintenance visit had been missed entirely the day before. Consolidated Regional, whose fleet review had been rescheduled twice and was now being discussed internally as a potential grounds for reviewing their service contract. Jensen Trucking, whose operations manager had heard through the industry network, the tight, efficient grapevine that connected fleet managers across the metro area, that something had happened at Horizon. That grapevine was the thing that kept Patricia awake at night. She had been in this industry long enough to know that reputation moved faster than trucks. A missed appointment was a problem. A missed appointment with no clear explanation was a rumor. And a rumor in a field where businesses trusted each other with millions of dollars worth of vehicles and the livelihoods that depended on them could compound faster than any invoice. She told Victoria exactly this at 8:15. Victoria listened, nodded, asked the right questions, then said, "What would Darius do right now? If he were here and dealing with these calls, what would he do?" Patricia looked at her steadily. He'd call each client himself. Not me. Him. He'd explain there was an internal situation being resolved, he'd give them a specific timeline, and he'd offer something concrete, a complimentary inspection, a priority scheduling slot, whatever was appropriate for that specific client's history. Because he knows each client's history. He knows what they care about. Jensen's operations manager cares about transparency above everything else. Harbor Freight cares about schedule reliability. Consolidated cares about their relationship with the person they talk to, not the company name. Patricia paused. He knows these things because he paid attention for 14 years, not because there's a file that says it. Victoria was quiet. "Can you call them?" Patricia asked. Not as a formal CEO response. Just call them the way he would call them, honest and direct. "I don't know what I can promise them in terms of timeline." Then tell them that. Tell them you're working to resolve it, and you'll have something concrete within 24 hours. Don't make it corporate, just make it true. Victoria looked at her phone. "Patricia, why are you helping me right now? You could have walked out with the rest of them." Patricia considered the question. "Because somebody has to keep the lights on while you figure out what you did wrong." She picked up her coffee. "And because I've seen enough ownership changes to know that the ones who can't admit a mistake are the ones who take everything down with them when they go. You don't seem like that kind of person." She moved toward the door. "Don't prove me wrong." Marcus Webb picked up the phone on the third ring. Not Victoria's call, he let hers go to voicemail both times. The call he picked up was from Tony Reyes, who at 51 was the oldest mechanic in the shop and had the particular telephone manner of a man who didn't call unless he had something specific to say. "You talked to Dee today?" "Yesterday evening," Marcus said. "He's okay." "Ryan Hayes came to his house." Marcus paused. "How do you know that?" "Jerome saw the car. He was driving past." Jerome was driving past Darius's house. He drives past it on his way home. They live 4 blocks apart. A pause. "What did Ryan want?" "I don't know. Dee didn't call me after." Tony was quiet for a moment. "You think this is going to resolve?" "Not hopeful, not doubtful, just asking." Marcus leaned back in his kitchen chair. "I think Victoria has to make a real decision. Not a managed decision. Not a PR decision. A real one. And if she doesn't, then we have to make one too." Tony took a breath. "I got a call this morning. Shop over on the east side. They heard things, wanted to know if I was looking." "Are you?" "I'm 51, Marcus. I'm not starting over somewhere new at 51 if there's a way to finish what we built here." Marcus understood that completely. He was 43 with a family and a mortgage and a life structured around a certain stability that you didn't rebuild easily. None of them had walked out with the illusion that it was cost-free. "Give it until end of week," Marcus said. "If nothing's moved by Friday, we figure out the next step." Okay. Tony paused. Tell D I said tell him we're good. Whatever he's thinking about us, tell him we're good. I'll tell him. The call ended. Marcus set the phone on the counter and looked out the kitchen window at nothing in particular. He thought about the morning it had happened. The way the silence had moved through the bay mechanic by mechanic, like something physical passing through a room. He had not planned it. He didn't think anyone had planned it. It had come from some place beneath planning, from some shared understanding that had never been put into words because it had never needed to be. They knew what Darius had given them, and they knew what Victoria's decision had said about what it was worth. Some things didn't need a meeting to be decided. On the third morning, Victoria Hayes drove to Darius Coleman's house. She did not call ahead. She recognized the irony of that she who had criticized impulsive decisions showing up unannounced at an employee's home. But she also recognized that calling ahead would give Darius the option of not being there, and she needed him to not have that option. Not out of power, out of necessity. Out of the specific understanding that some conversations could not happen over the phone, because some conversations required a person to look another person in the face. She pulled up at 9:15 in the morning. He was in the driveway. Not under the truck this time. He was crouched beside his daughter's bicycle, which was upended with the rear wheel off, and Amara was standing next to him, holding a tire lever and watching his hands with the concentrated attention of a child learning something real. Victoria sat in her car for a moment. She watched Darius show Amara how to work the tire off the rim patient, precise, explaining each step without condescension, treating the 8-year-old's attention as something worth honoring. She watched Amara frown at a specific step, ask something, and watched Darius stop, completely reset, and explain it differently. Not frustrated, just present. She thought about the word she'd used. Valuable. Infrastructure. She got out of the car. Darius looked up. His face registered no surprise, which meant either he'd expected her, or he'd trained himself not to show it. She couldn't tell which. Amara looked at the woman in the good blazer standing at the edge of their driveway. "Hi," Amara said. "Hi," Victoria said. She managed a small, genuine smile. "What happened to the bike?" "Flat tire. Daddy's teaching me to fix it myself." "That's a good thing to know." "I know." Amara looked back at her father. "Daddy says the best skill you can have is knowing how to fix your own problems." Something moved across Victoria's face. Darius had gone back to the wheel. He wasn't performing indifference, he was just working, giving her the room to say whatever she'd come to say in her own time. "Amara," he said, "can you go inside and get me the patch kit? It's in the red toolbox under the sink." Amara looked between her father and the woman at the end of the driveway, with the particular curiosity of a child who understands that something adult is happening and has the grace to step out of it. "Okay." She handed Darius the tire lever. "It was nice to meet you." "You too," Victoria said. Amara went inside. The driveway went quiet. Victoria walked closer, stopped a few feet from where Darius was crouched. He looked up at her. "You've had my number for 3 days, he said. "I know." She held his gaze. "I needed to say this to your face." He waited. She had rehearsed this. She had written it out the night she couldn't sleep, refined it, thought about the right professional, framing, the right acknowledgement of the business. About the right professional, framing, the right acknowledgement of the business. Impact, the right forward-looking language that corporate training had given her for exactly this kind of situation. She threw all of it out. "I didn't see you," she said. "I mean that specifically. I saw your output. I saw your numbers. I saw what the department produced. I didn't see the person doing it." She stopped, found the harder truth. "And I think on some level I made assumptions about you that I wouldn't have made about someone who looked different or came from a different background. I'm not going to dress that up. That's what happened." Darius looked at her steadily. "That's a hard thing to say. It's a harder thing to have lived through." The word hung there. She hadn't planned it. It had come out of the honest place, the place where the written version got left behind. "I want to fix this," Victoria said. "Not for the contracts, not for the clients. Because what I did to you was wrong, and I want to fix what I broke." Darius set the tire lever down on the concrete. "You didn't just break something professional," he said. His voice was even, not angry, honest. "You told 14 men that the work they do, the real work, the physical work, the work that keeps everything else running is less valuable than a degree and a last name. That's not a personnel decision. That's a statement about worth." "I know. Do you?" He looked at her. "Because I need you to understand what it costs a person, what it costs a black man specifically in a field where I have fought for every inch of credibility I have ever had, to watch someone walk in and be handed what I built. Not because of what they can do, because of who they're related to." He paused. "I have been working since I was 17. I have been the best mechanic in every shop I've ever walked into. I have been looked past, talked over, underestimated, and dismissed more times than I can count. I came to Horizon, and I built something real. Something that worked. And you walked in, and you looked at me, and you saw what an old mechanic with a worn toolbox who didn't fit the image you had for your rebranded company." Victoria didn't flinch. She took it. "Yes," she said quietly. "That's closer to the truth than I'm comfortable admitting." A silence. From inside the house, the faint sound of Amara rummaging for the patch kit. "Losing the title wasn't the worst of it," Darius said. "The worst of it was realizing that after 14 years, you still saw me the same way the customers did at my first job. Like someone who was good with his hands and nothing else." He looked at the upended bicycle. "I raised a daughter alone. I kept a company alive. I trained men who are better at this job than they ever would have been without someone choosing to teach them. I built systems that are going to run long after I'm gone from that place. And you looked at all of that and decided your nephew with 6 weeks in the building was better positioned to lead it." "How wasn't?" Victoria said. "He isn't. I know that now." "What changed?" "I read your maintenance files. Ryan read them first and called me. Then I read them myself." She met his eyes. "I understood about a third of the technical content, but I understood every bit of what they told me about who wrote them." Darius didn't say anything. "A person who thinks about their work when they're not there," she said. He looked at her sharply. "Ryan told me what you said to him, in the driveway." She kept her voice even. "He called me after he left your house. He said he needed me to understand what he'd read and what it meant." She paused. "He told me you didn't turn him away. You gave him something to think about. He came here and was honest. That deserves something back. He's different than he was a week ago. People can change fast when reality shows up." Victoria nodded slowly. "I want you to come back," she said. "As lead mechanic. As department head. The title, the authority, everything restored fully and documented properly. Ryan returns to a support role. If he earns his way into more responsibility over time, he earns it. If he doesn't, he doesn't." She took a breath. "But I also want to understand beyond the title. What would it take for you to trust this place again?" Darius looked at her for a long moment. "That's the right question," he said. "I'm learning which questions to ask." He was quiet, thinking. Not performing consideration, actually thinking the way he approached everything. "The promotion structure has to change," he said finally. "In writing. Promotions tied to demonstrated skill and documented performance. Not relationships, not family. Not someone's idea of who fits the image. The criteria have to be transparent, and they have to apply to everyone equally." Done. "The apprenticeship program needs real investment. These young guys deserve structured development, not just being handed tasks. I want to build something that actually prepares people." Done. "And I want it in their contracts, the mechanics, all 14 of them, that what happened this week cannot be used against them. No record of the walkout used in any future performance review or disciplinary action. They stood for something real. They don't get penalized for it." Victoria nodded. "I'll have Patricia draft the documentation today." Amara came back through the front door with the red patch. Kit stopped on the top step when she saw that the two adults were still talking and sat down patiently to wait. Darius looked at his daughter. Then he looked back at Victoria. "I'll think about it," he said. "That's all I'm asking." She turned to go, got 3 steps toward her car. "Victoria." She turned back. When you made that announcement in the bay, Ryan standing behind you, did you look at the room? She thought about it honestly. Not really. I was focused on the delivery. 14 people. Every one of them was waiting to see if you knew what you were doing. He picked up the tire lever. Leadership isn't the announcement. It's what you know about the room before you open your mouth. She held that. I'll remember that. She drove away. Darius looked at the bicycle, looked at his daughter on the step. You ready? He said. Amara stood up immediately, patch kit in hand, and bounded down the steps. Who was that? My boss. Amara settled in beside him, watching his hands. What did she want? She wanted to apologize. Amara considered that. Did she mean it? Darius looked at the bicycle tire in his hands. Thought about the pad of paper he'd somehow known she'd been writing on. Thought about the way she'd thrown out whatever she'd rehearsed and said the hard thing instead. Yeah, he said. I think she did. Are you going back to work? Still thinking about it. Amara handed him the patch kit already opened. You should go back, she said matter-of-factly. Because you like the work. And Jerome misses you. He texted me yesterday. Darius looked at his daughter. Jerome texted you. I have his number from the garage Christmas party. He said to tell you he said hi. She looked at the tire. What do I do with this part? He showed her. She watched his hands with her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness. And Darius Coleman crouched in his driveway with a bicycle tire, and a daughter who had the whole world still to walk into felt the weight in his chest shift slightly. Not gone, but different. Marcus's phone rang at noon. He looked at the screen. Darius. He picked up before the second ring. Well, she came to the house. I heard. How did you hear? Jerome. Jerome needs to stop driving past my house. He's not, he just lives nearby. A pause. What happened? Darius was quiet for a second. She said the right things. She was honest. She said the hard things instead of the safe things. That's something. It's a start. Another pause. I told her the promotion structure needs to change, in writing, and that no one gets penalized for this week. Marcus was quiet. And? He knew Darius well enough to hear the thing under the thing. She agreed, without negotiating, without qualifying it. Darius paused. That surprised me. So you're going back? I said I'd think about it. D. I'm thinking. D. Those guys have been sitting on their hands for 3 days because they trust you to make the right call. Not because they're waiting for a sign. Because they trust your judgment. Whatever you decide, they'll follow. Darius didn't answer immediately. That's a lot of weight to put on one person. You've been carrying it for 14 years. What's a few more days? A sound that was almost a laugh. Call Tony, Darius said. Tell him to stop looking at that East Side shop. Marcus let out a long, slow breath. Yeah. Not yet. Tell him not yet. Okay? Marcus steadied his voice. Okay, D. And Marcus. Yeah. Tell Jerome to stop driving past my house. Marcus was already smiling. I'll tell him. He won't stop. I know. The call ended. Marcus set the phone on the counter. He stood in his kitchen for a moment, very still, feeling the tension of 3 days begin to release from somewhere in his shoulders that he hadn't realized had been locked. Then he picked the phone back up and called Tony. That evening, Ryan Hayes sat alone in the main service bay. He had come back after hours. Not because anyone had asked him to. Not because there was any practical reason to be in an empty garage at 8 in the evening. He had come back because he couldn't stop thinking. He walked the length of the bay slowly. He looked at the tools still laid out where they'd been set down 3 days ago. He looked at the half-finished transmission on the center lift, which he now understood enough about from 2 days of reading to know that it was a job Darius would never have left in that state if he'd had the choice. That it had been left there was its own kind of statement. Not careless. The opposite. It said we were in the middle of something real, And this is what your decision interrupted. He stopped at Darius's primary workstation. The toolbox was gone. Darius had taken it the morning he walked out. But the station itself was still his. The arrangement of the secondary tools on the pegboard. The shelf with the technical manuals, each one marked with small adhesive tabs in different colors. The clipboard hanging from the lower shelf with the current work orders. Ryan lifted the clipboard. He read through the work orders. Each one was annotated not just what needed to be done, but why, what to watch for, what the history of that particular vehicle meant for the job at hand. He thought about his first week at Horizon. The way he'd walked through this bay with his aunt looking at it the way you look at something you're about to reorganize. Like a consultant viewing a system. Looking for inefficiencies. Looking for things he could improve. He had never once looked for what was already working. He had never once asked what 14 years of accumulated understanding was actually worth. He hung the clipboard back on the shelf. He stood at that workstation for a long time. Then he did something he had not done in all his 6 weeks at Horizon. He picked up a rag. He started cleaning. Not because it needed it. Not for any practical purpose. Because he needed to do something with his hands. Because he needed to touch this place the way the men who built it touched it, not from above, not through a spreadsheet, but directly. Physically. With some part of his body that understood work, the way understanding had to come before respect. He cleaned until the bay was dark and his arms were tired. Then he turned off the lights and went home. He didn't know if Darius was coming back, but he knew that whoever came back would walk into a bay that had been cared for, however imperfectly, by someone learning what it meant to try. He wasn't sure that was enough. He was starting to understand that it had to be the beginning. Darius didn't sleep well that night, not because he was angry. The anger had moved through him and settled into something quieter and more complicated days ago. Not because he was uncertain about Victoria's sincerity. He'd been reading people his entire life, and he knew the difference between a rehearsed apology and a real one. She'd thrown out the rehearsed version in his driveway and said the hard thing instead, and that mattered. What kept him awake was simpler and more difficult than any of that. I was thinking about the men. Tony, 51 years old, with a kid in college, and a call from an East Side shop sitting in his recent history. Marcus, who had a mortgage and a family, and had stood up in that bay without hesitating, because that was who Marcus Webb was, and who deserved better than to have his loyalty become a liability. Jerome, 23. His whole career still ahead of him, who had said, "I'm not watching that happen again," and doing nothing with a steadiness that had no business being in a 23-year-old, and that Darius knew had cost him something real to find. 11 others. Each one with a life outside those bay doors. Each one who had made a choice that morning not because Darius had asked them to, he'd begged them not to, but because something in them had decided that some things were worth standing for, even when standing was expensive. He lay in the dark and thought about what it meant to walk back in, not for himself. He'd settled that part. Somewhere between Victoria leaving his driveway and Amara handing him the patch kit already opened, he'd settled it. The work was his. The garage was his in the way that a place becomes yours when you pour 14 years of yourself into it. Walking away from it permanently would feel like abandoning something he'd built, and Darius Coleman had never abandoned anything he'd built. But walking back in meant something. It meant the men who had stood beside him were vindicated, yes, but it also meant they were coming back into a building where 4 days ago they'd been made to feel like their loyalty and their labor were interchangeable parts. And Darius needed to know before he walked through those doors that he was bringing them back into something genuinely different. Not a managed version of the same situation with better language around it. Something actually different. He got up at 4:30, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table in the dark. He got out a legal pad and a pen. The same way he wrote his maintenance notes by hand, because he thought more clearly when his hand was moving, and he started writing. Not a list of demands, not a grievance, a structure. What Horizon could actually look like if someone ran it the way it deserved to be run. The apprenticeship program he'd been designing in his head for 3 years without anyone ever asking him to. The promotion criteria that needed to be transparent and documented. The client relationship protocols that should be formalized so that institutional knowledge didn't live in one person's head and disappear when that person left. He wrote for 2 hours. When Amara came out at 6:30, she found him at the table with 4 pages of notes and a cold cup of coffee. "Daddy, you didn't sleep." "I slept some." She looked at the legal pad. She couldn't read most of it. His handwriting got compressed and specific when he was working through something, but she recognized the quality of concentration in it. "Is that about going back?" "It's about what going back should look like." She opened the refrigerator, got the orange juice, poured 2 glasses without being asked the way she'd started doing about a year ago, and set one in front of him. "Jerome texted again," she said. Darius looked up. "Amara." "I didn't text him first. He texted me." "What did he say?" She picked up her phone from the counter and read it with the slight formality she used when quoting someone else. "Tell your dad we're ready when he is. No rush, but we're ready." She set the phone down. That's all he said. Darius looked at his legal pad. "No rush," he said quietly. "What does that mean?" "It means they trust me." Amara drank her juice, watched him. "That's a good thing, right?" "It's the best thing," Darius said. "And the heaviest." He called Victoria at 8 o'clock. She picked up on the first ring, which told him she'd been waiting. "I've been thinking about what coming back needs to look like," he said. "Not just for me, for all of them." "Tell me." I went through it. Not the way he'd written it. He knew how to translate the technical into the conversational, but all of it. The promotion structure in writing with specific criteria, tied to documented performance applied uniformly with no exceptions for personal relationships. The apprenticeship program formally funded with a curriculum he would develop, and the authority to run it without interference. The client relationship protocols formalized, so that the knowledge that kept Horizon alive didn't live exclusively in anyone's head. The agreement about the walkout, nothing in anyone's file, no record used against anyone, ever. And one more thing. "Ryan starts over," he said. "Not fired, not removed. But he starts at the bottom of the technical track, same as any other person new to the shop floor. He cleans, he assists, he asks questions, he earns every step. If he has the character to do that, really do it, not perform it for 2 weeks, and then expect to be recognized, then in a year he might actually be useful." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "He's not going to love that." "I know. He agreed to it already, 2 nights ago on the phone. He said he needed to start where he should have started." Darius hadn't expected that. He was quiet. "He cleaned the bay last night," Victoria said. "After hours. Nobody asked him to. Patricia found it when she came in this morning. She called me." A pause. She said it was the first thing he'd done that she believed. Darius held the phone. He thought about Ryan in his driveway. The rehearsed version he'd thrown out. The honest thing he'd said instead. People can change fast when reality shows up. "One more thing," Darius said. "Okay. I want to talk to the team before I come back. All of them together. Not you, not Ryan. Me and them in the bay before the official return. They need to hear from me directly, not through you, not through a memo, what I know, what was agreed, and what I think it means." "That's yes, of course." "And Victoria." "Yes. When I walk back in, and when they walk back in, I need that to mean something in how this place operates from that day forward. Not a speech, not a newsletter. The actual work of it. Changed policy, changed culture, changed practice. I need to see it built, not announced." "I understand the difference," Victoria said. "I've spent 3 days learning it." A pause. "Monday," she said. "Monday," Darius said. "But I'm calling Marcus first." Marcus answered on the second ring. "Talk to me." "Monday," Darius said. The line was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "You sure?" "I'm sure about going back. I'm sure about what it needs to look like. I'm not sure about everything that comes after, but nobody ever is." What did she agree to? Darius walked him through it. All of it. Marcus listened without interrupting, which was not his natural mode. He was a man who asked questions in real time, which told Darius how seriously he was taking every word. When Darius finished, Marcus said, "The promotion structure in writing. That's the one that matters most." "I know. Because that's the one that protects Jerome, and the guys who come after Jerome." "I know, Marcus." "Okay." A long breath. "Okay. Monday. I want to talk to everyone Friday. Can you get them together?" "I'll have them at my place by 6. You want food." "I want everyone there." "LaShonda will make something. People come when there's food." A pause. "Tony's going to cry." "Tony is not going to cry." "Tony is absolutely going to cry. He cried at Jerome's 6-month review when you said Jerome had earned a raise. That was a private moment. There were 8 people in the room, D." Darius rubbed his face. "Just get them together." "They'll be there." Marcus's voice went quieter. "I'm glad, man. I know it wasn't a simple call. None of the right calls are." "No," Marcus said. "They never are." Friday evening. Marcus Webb's house was full in a way that houses are only full when people actually want to be somewhere. All 14 mechanics, 3 apprentices. The kind of gathering that didn't need to be organized because the occasion organized itself. LaShonda Webb had made a pot of chili the size of a small bathtub and cornbread that filled the kitchen with the kind of smell that made people slow down when they walked through the door. Kids ran between legs in the hallway. Someone had brought a case of soda. Someone else had brought beer, which sat in the cooler without anyone touching it yet, because this wasn't that kind of night. Not yet. Darius arrived at 6:15. He walked in, and the room got quieter. Not the way a room gets quiet when someone unwelcome arrives, but the way it gets quiet when someone you've been waiting for finally walks through the door. Marcus handed him a bowl of chili without asking. Darius stood in the kitchen and looked around the room at these men. Jerome on the couch, who looked up with an expression that was trying to be casual and not quite managing it. Tony, who was standing near the window with his arms crossed and whose eyes went briefly bright before he looked away at the middle distance. The younger guys, the apprentices. Marcus's kid, Marcus Jr., who was 19 and had started at Horizon 8 months ago, and 2 others who were sitting on the floor because there weren't enough chairs and who had an alertness about them that said they understood this was something they needed to see. Darius didn't make them wait. "I talked to Victoria Hayes on Thursday morning," he said. The room went completely still. "I want to tell you what was agreed because you stood for something this week, and you deserve to hear what it produced directly from me." He walked them through all of it. The promotion criteria in writing, the apprenticeship program, the client protocols, the clean record for everyone in that room regarding the walkout. He watched their faces as he spoke. He watched Marcus, who nodded slowly at the promotion criteria. He watched Tony, who exhaled something long and quiet when Darius said the word documented and uniformly applied. He watched Jerome, who looked at the floor and back up and then at his hands, and Darius knew exactly what Jerome was thinking, because Jerome was thinking about the word aptitude and about a person who had told him that word was a lie. "Ryan Hayes," Darius said, and the room shifted slightly. "He's coming back as a floor apprentice, starting at the bottom of the technical track. He asked for that himself." A few exchanged glances. "I believe him," Darius said. "I'm not asking you to believe him yet. Belief gets earned. But I'm telling you that the person I talked to in my driveway 4 nights ago was not the same person who walked into that bay 6 weeks ago. People can change. We don't have to trust the change. We just have to give it the room to prove itself." Nobody argued with that. "I want to be clear about one thing," Darius said. He looked around the room, slowly making contact with each person. "What you did this week, I didn't ask for it. I tried to stop it. But I have thought about it every day since it happened, and I want you to understand what it meant to me." He paused. Not for effect. Because the words needed a moment before he let them out. "I have spent my entire career fighting to be seen. Not celebrated. Not promoted past what I'd earned. Just seen. For what I actually do and who I actually am." He stopped again. "You saw me. In front of the person who had the power in that room, you stood still and said he matters. What he gave us matters. He looked at his bowl, then back at them. I don't have the right language for what that is. I'm not sure there is right language for it. But I needed you to know that I know what it cost. And I'm going to spend whatever time I have left at that garage making sure it was worth it. The room was completely quiet. Then Tony Reyes, 51 years old, who had been a mechanic for 28 years, and who did not under any circumstances show emotion in professional settings. Tony Reyes looked at the ceiling, pressed his lips together, and made a sound in the back of his throat that was not quite under control. Marcus from across the room said nothing. He just looked at Darius with an expression that said, I told you Tony was going to cry. Darius looked back with an expression that said, don't. Marcus pressed his lips together. His shoulders moved. He turned toward the chili pot and occupied himself very deliberately with stirring something that did not need stirring. Jerome stood up from the couch. He was young enough that standing up when he wanted to say something still felt natural before life teaches you to stay in your seat. Can I say something? Darius looked at him. When I came to Horizon, you remember what you told me about the word aptitude? I remember. I want you to know that I've thought about that almost every day since. Jerome looked at him steadily. Not because I needed the reminder, because it changed the way I work, the way I think about the job. Because somebody told me that the ceiling other people put on me wasn't real, and then showed me every single day by just doing the work the way you do it, that they were right. He paused. Whatever you built in that garage, you built some of it in us. And we weren't going to let someone tell us that was worth less than a last name. The room was quiet. Darius looked at this 23-year-old man who had walked into his garage, scared, and left. It was still leaving it every day changed. He thought about his uncle handing him a toolbox at 17, about the specific gravity of a person choosing to invest in you when they have no obligation to. Thank you, Darius said. It was quiet and direct and entirely insufficient and completely right. Jerome nodded and sat back down. Marcus turned away from the chili pot. His eyes were dry. His jaw was set. Monday, he said. To the room, to everyone. Monday, 14 voices said in the loose, overlapping way of men who weren't trying to be synchronized, but were anyway. Sunday morning came the way it always did. $5 bill in the left front pocket. 2 blocks to the corner bakery. Amara with her hand in his, walking at the particular pace of a child who is not in a hurry, because Sunday has no hurry in it. Chocolate croissant, she said before they were even inside. I remember. I just wanted to make sure. Amara, I have never once forgotten the chocolate croissant. There was that one time. That was a different bakery, and it was their fault, not mine. She grinned. He held the door open. They got their order chocolate croissant for her plain coffee and a blueberry muffin for him, and sat at the small table by the window, the one they always tried to get, the one that looked out onto the sidewalk where Sunday morning moved at its own unhurried speed. Amara ate her croissant with the focused pleasure of someone who knows a good thing when she has it. Are you nervous? She asked without looking up from the croissant. About Monday. He thought about it honestly. Not nervous, just aware. She looked up at him. She had her mother's eyes and her father's habit of waiting for the complete thought. It's not the same as walking back in like nothing happened, he said. Because something happened, something real. And now I'm walking back in knowing that the guys in that building stood up for me. And Victoria looked at herself honestly and didn't like what she saw. And Ryan went into that bay after hours and cleaned it because he needed to do something with his hands. He looked at his coffee. Things that are different now have to stay different. That's what I'm aware of. What if they don't? Then I'll know sooner this time. And I'll make different choices sooner. Amara considered that. Miss Gloria says you should have asked for a raise a long time ago. Darius looked at his daughter. Miss Gloria says a lot of things. She says you're too patient. She's not wrong. She also says you're the most competent person she's ever met, and whoever doesn't see that is blind. Amara picked up the croissant. I think she has a crush on you. Amara, I'm just saying what I observe. He laughed. Real and unpracticed, the kind that surprised him. He hadn't laughed like that in a week. It felt like something coming back into service. Amara smiled at him over her croissant, with her mother's eyes satisfied. Monday morning. Darius pulled into the lot at 7:50. The bay doors were up. The compressors were running. Through the open doors, he could hear the sound of the place breathing again, that industrial heartbeat that meant work was happening. He sat in the truck for his 30 seconds. Not different. Not longer. The same ritual, the same centering, the same quiet acknowledgement that the day was going to need something from him, and he was choosing to give it. He got out. Marcus was standing just inside the bay doors. Not waiting dramatically, just standing there the way you stand somewhere you belong. He gave Darius a nod when he walked in. Darius gave one back. The bay was alive, every station occupied. Jerome at his bench, head down, hands moving. Tony at the center lift, already mid-inspection on a Jensen trucking vehicle. The apprentices in their positions learning. The sound of it, the layered mechanical human sound of a group of people working in practiced proximity, was the most specific kind of beautiful that Darius knew how to recognize. Patricia appeared at the top of the office stairs. "Welcome back," she said, not with ceremony, with the satisfied brevity of someone who had been holding things together and was relieved to hand them off properly. "Patricia, what's the priority board look like?" "Jensen needs 2 inspections completed by 3. Harbor Freight called, they want their preventive maintenance rescheduled for Wednesday, and they specifically asked if you'd be leading it." Metro Delivery sent a card. She paused. An actual paper card. Their driver Calvin wrote a note inside. "What does it say?" Patricia smiled, the small, precise smile she reserved for things that actually moved her. "He says he heard you were coming back, and he wanted to say thank you. He said he'd been with 4 service providers over his career, and you were the first one who ever called him by his name." Darius stood with that for a moment. Then he walked to his station. His toolbox was back where it belonged. He'd brought it in on Sunday evening after Amara was in bed, because he'd wanted to be ready Monday, without making it a moment just done practical, his hands on something real. He opened the top drawer. Ran his fingers along the organized rows of tools, the way he always did at the start of a shift. Not checking for missing tools. Just making contact. Just saying, "I'm here. We're starting." He pulled his work order clipboard off the hook. He heard footsteps on his left. Ryan Hayes was walking toward him. Wearing clothes that were finally right, work pants, a proper shop shirt, boots, with actual sole support. He looked like he'd been up early. He looked for the first time since Darius had met him like someone who was in a place he wasn't entirely sure he deserved to be. That uncertainty, Darius thought, was the most encouraging thing he'd seen from Ryan yet. Ryan stopped a respectful distance away. "I wanted to say it here," Ryan said. "In the bay. Not in a driveway, not on the phone. Here." Darius looked at him. "I took something that wasn't mine. I took it because someone who loved me offered it, and I let myself believe I'd earned it because it was easier than admitting I hadn't." He didn't look away. "I'm sorry. For what I took from you. For the seal failure I caused because I changed something I didn't understand. For the weeks I spent being corrected by you and responding with resentment instead of gratitude." A pause. "I'm starting at the bottom. I'm not doing it to prove something to you or to my aunt. I'm doing it because it's where I actually am. And because I want to find out if there's a version of me that could actually belong in a place like this." Darius looked at him for a long moment. The bay moved around them, tools and air compressors, and the low conversation of men at work. The living sound of the place. "You know what the first job is for a new floor assistant?" Ryan shook his head. "You check every fluid level on every vehicle that comes in before it goes on a lift. Every one. You document it. You hand the documentation to the mechanic assigned to the vehicle. You don't interpret it, you don't diagnose it, you document it, and you hand it over." Ryan nodded. "You do that for 3 weeks. Every vehicle, every shift. Without complaining, and without trying to do more. Then we see what's next." "Okay." "Ryan." He met Darius's eyes. "Do the small thing well, that's all. Everything else comes from that." Ryan nodded. Something in his face, Some tightness that had been there since the day he walked in, released very slightly. He went to the supply cabinet, got a fluid documentation form, and walked toward the first vehicle in the intake queue. Darius watched him go. Then he turned to his own work order. Jensen inspection. Due by 3. He picked up his clipboard. He felt Marcus come up beside him, not standing too close, just close enough. Good. Darius looked at the work order. At the bay around him. At the 14 men who had chosen something hard because they'd decided some things were worth it. Good, he said. He walked toward the lift. Victoria Hayes stood at the window of the second-floor office and looked down at the main bay. The lifts were up and occupied. The tools were moving. The compressors were running. The sound of the place was the sound she'd taken for granted for 4 months, without understanding what it was made of. She watched Darius move through the bay, watched the way the room organized itself around him without drama. Not because he commanded it, but because his presence set a standard that everyone else calibrated to without being asked. She watched Marcus hand Jerome something with a correction and a nod. She watched Tony explain something to one of the apprentices slowly, with his hands the way you teach someone something you want them to actually understand. She watched Ryan Hayes crouch beside a vehicle in the intake queue with a documentation form checking fluid levels, writing it down. She had told her assistant to cancel the afternoon's scheduled calls. She wanted to be in the building today. Not to oversee. Not to manage. Just to be present in the thing she almost destroyed. To understand it properly by watching it work. Patricia knocked and opened the office door without waiting. Harbor Freight confirmed Wednesday. They specifically requested the visit be led by Darius. Tell them it will be. Consolidated Regional's operations manager called. He'd heard Darius was back. He said, and I'm quoting, "Please tell him we're glad. That's all. Just that." Victoria looked at the bay below. Tell him we got the message. Patricia started to leave. Patricia. She turned back. I owe you a real conversation about the last 4 months. About what I missed and what you saw and what you were managing that nobody asked you to manage. Victoria met her eyes. Can we find time this week? Patricia looked at her for a moment. The precise, calibrated look of a woman who had been in this industry long enough to know the difference between a CEO performing accountability and a CEO actually practicing it. Whatever she found in Victoria's face, it satisfied something. Thursday afternoon, she said. I'll put it on the calendar. She pulled the door closed behind her. Victoria turned back to the window. Below in the bay, Darius Coleman was elbow-deep in a Jensen trucking vehicle, moving with the total concentration of a man who knew what he was doing and why it mattered. Not performing, not proving anything, just working. She had owned this company for 4 months and 2 weeks. She was beginning only now to understand what she had bought. Not a facility. Not a client list. Not a fleet maintenance contract portfolio. She had bought 14 years of a man's life poured into a practice. She had bought the trust of men who showed up every day and gave their real skill to a place because someone had made it worth giving it to. She had bought relationships with clients who called and asked for someone by name because that someone had spent years earning the right to be named. She had almost thrown all of it away because she confused vision with wisdom and family with merit. She stood at the window for a long time. Then she went downstairs and walked out into the bay. Not to announce anything, not to manage anything, just to be in it. She walked to the service record station, picked up the current work order log. Read it the way you read something when you're actually trying to learn it. Marcus glanced at her from his station, said nothing, went back to his work. Tony registered her presence, gave a single nod, and returned his attention to the vehicle on his lift. Jerome didn't look up at all. He was in the middle of something, and he was focused the way Darius had taught him to be focused completely with his whole mind. Nobody performed for her. Nobody managed her presence. They just worked. Victoria Hayes stood in the bay of Horizon Fleet Solutions and felt for the first time since she'd walked in 4 months ago like she was in the right place for the right reason. It was a small feeling. Quiet. Nothing like the confidence she'd walked in with that first day in her heeled boots. But it was real. and she was beginning to understand that real was where everything worth building had to start. 6 months is not a long time in the life of a garage. Machines don't change in 6 months. The work doesn't change. The smell of hot metal and brake fluid doesn't change. The weight of a torque wrench in your hand at 7 in the morning doesn't change. The particular quality of concentration that a mechanic carries when he's inside a problem. Head down hands, moving the rest of the world on hold, that doesn't change either. But people change. Organizations change. The invisible architecture of how a place treats the people inside it that can change when the right person decides it has to and follows the decision with actual work rather than announcement. Horizon Fleet Solutions changed, not all at once. Not dramatically. Not in the way of press releases and rebranding campaigns and motivational posters on break room walls. It changed the way most real things change incrementally, sometimes painfully, through the accumulated weight of small decisions made consistently over time. Darius had understood this from the beginning. He hadn't walked back through those bay doors expecting a transformed company. He had walked back through them expecting the opportunity to build one properly. This time with the authority and the structure and the documented commitment that made building something permanent possible. He got to work. The first version of the promotion criteria document took him 3 evenings at his kitchen table. He wrote it by hand on the legal pad, first always by hand, always the legal pad, and then typed it up with Patricia's help, because Patricia had a way of translating his technical precision into language that would hold up administratively. They went back and forth on it for a week. Patricia pushed him on specific language around measurable performance standards. He pushed back on anything that left room for subjective interpretation. They met in the middle, which was where most things worth having lived. Victoria reviewed the final version. She didn't change a word. She signed it on a Wednesday afternoon and had Patricia distribute copies to every mechanic and every member of the management team, including Ryan, the same day. Marcus read his copy standing at his workbench. He read it twice. Then he folded it with the particular care of someone handling something that matters and put it in the front pocket of his work shirt, which was where Marcus kept things he needed to be able to reach quickly. Jerome read his that evening at home. He told Darius the next morning that he'd read it 3 times. The part about documented performance, Jerome said, where it says advancement is based on demonstrated skill, assessed by a panel, not by a single supervisor's recommendation. Yeah. That means no one person can just decide somebody doesn't belong. That's what it means. Jerome was quiet for a moment. You wrote that part specifically, didn't you? It wasn't a question. Darius didn't answer it like one. I wrote all of it with you in mind, you and everyone who comes after you. Jerome looked at his workbench. His jaw worked briefly. Okay, he said. That was all. Okay. But in Jerome's vocabulary, in the economy of a young man who had learned to be careful with his words because the wrong people had used the wrong words about him, okay meant something large and permanent. Darius nodded and went back to his work order. The apprenticeship program launched 8 weeks after Darius returned. He'd been building it quietly the entire time, developing the curriculum during lunch breaks, consulting with Marcus and Tony on the technical components, calling 2 former colleagues at other shops who ran programs he respected. He wanted it to be real, not a gesture toward development, not a checkbox for some HR audit. Something that actually changed what a young person could become if they came to Horizon and put in the work. The first cohort was 3 people. Marcus Jr., who had been floating without formal structure for 8 months and had a natural instinct for engine diagnostics that reminded Darius of himself at 19. A young woman named Keisha, who had applied 3 times before being hired and whose persistence Darius had specifically noted in her file. And a kid named David who was 21, who had grown up in foster care, who had learned to fix things because fixing things was the one skill that had never depended on who was supposed to be taking care of him. Darius sat all 3 of them down on the first morning of the program. No presentation, no slideshow, just 3 people and 1 man at a work table in the side bay. You are here because you belong here, he said. Not because I'm being generous. Not because this company needed to look a certain way. Because you demonstrated something that warranted investment. Every one of you. He looked at each of them in turn. I'm going to teach you things it took me 20 years to learn. Some of it is technical. Most of it is how to think, how to listen to a problem, how to stay with something when it's difficult and you don't have an answer yet. He paused. I'm going to hold you to a high standard, because a high standard is the most respectful thing I can offer you. Anyone who tells you different is making your ceiling lower while they smile at you. David, the 21-year-old, who had grown up fixing things because no one else was going to fix them, looked at Darius with an expression that Darius recognized from 11 months ago on Jerome's face. The expression of someone hearing a truth they'd needed and not known they were waiting for. Darius recognized it because he'd felt it himself once. At 17. When his uncle had handed him a toolbox and said, "Whatever you do, do it so well, they can't pretend you weren't there." How was handing something forward now? Not the toolbox that was his that stayed with him, but the weight behind it, the understanding, the refusal to let the ceiling someone else built become the ceiling you accepted. That was what got handed forward. Ryan Hayes, 6 months in from the bottom, had become something that nobody in that garage, including Ryan himself, had fully predicted. He was not a natural mechanic. He would probably never be. His hands didn't have the instinctive relationship with machinery that came from years of accumulated experience, and he was honest enough with himself now to know that some things needed time you couldn't compress. But he had become something more surprising, a genuinely useful presence. He documented everything, meticulously, obsessively, with the systematic attention to detail that his education had actually prepared him for, turned now towards something real rather than something abstracted. He created a digital maintenance tracking system that cross-referenced Darius's handwritten notes with digital records, making 14 years of institutional knowledge searchable and shareable for the first time. He developed client communication templates that preserved the personal tone Darius had always used while creating enough structure that other people could maintain those relationships in Darius's absence without losing the quality. He still got things wrong. He asked questions that revealed how much he still didn't know, which was frequent and which he'd stopped being embarrassed about. He deferred to Darius on technical decisions without resentment, or if there was residual resentment, he'd gotten good enough at managing it that it didn't affect his work. And he cleaned. Every evening before he left, he swept his section of the bay. Nobody had asked him to continue past the first week. He'd just kept doing it. Marcus had told Darius around the 3rd month that he'd started thinking of Ryan differently. Not as a mechanic, not as the nephew, as someone learning to belong somewhere. That's the hardest thing to learn, Marcus said. Some people never do. He's doing the work, Darius said. He's doing the right work. There's a difference. Darius had thought about that for days afterward. The right work. Not the impressive work. Not the work that got noticed. The work that needed doing, done with care without an audience. One afternoon, about 4 months in, Ryan had come to Darius with the fluid documentation for a harbor freight vehicle routine, the job he'd been doing since day one, and pointed to an anomaly in the power steering fluid. A slight discoloration that the checklist didn't specifically flag, but that Ryan had noticed because he'd been doing this job long enough that he'd started to see patterns. Darius had looked at it, checked the vehicle's history. There was a slow seal degradation that would have become a problem in about 3 weeks and 2,000 miles. He pulled the vehicle for inspection, found the issue, addressed it before it became a roadside failure. He'd gone back to Ryan afterward. Good catch. Ryan looked at him. I just filled out the form. You filled it out carefully enough to see something. That's not nothing. Darius held his gaze. That's the beginning of the right instinct. Ryan was quiet for a moment. It's not the same as what you do. Not yet. Maybe never the same, but it doesn't have to be the same. It just has to be real. Darius went back to his station. Document the catch in the vehicle file. Note the date, the indicator, and the correction. That's how knowledge stays in the building instead of walking out with the person who found it. Ryan documented it. He documented everything after that, with that specific addition, not just what he found, but how he found it. The small flag that had caught his eye. the comparison to the previous record, the reasoning behind the decision to escalate. Darius read every one. He said nothing about it publicly, but he read them, and he kept them in the same file with his own notes cross-referenced, because that was how a practice became institutional rather than personal. That was how a building learned to remember. The company celebration was Victoria's idea. She'd proposed it at the 4-month mark, and Darius had told her to wait. Not because he didn't want to acknowledge what had been built. He did, but because he'd learned to be precise about timing. You didn't celebrate a thing before it had proven it was going to last. You waited until you had enough distance to know the difference between a new beginning and a temporary adjustment. At 6 months, he told her now, she'd asked what he wanted it to look like. Not a ceremony, he said. Not a speech event. A gathering. In the bay after the workday ends. Bring food. Let people talk. If something needs to be said, we'll say it. But the point is the people being in the same room, not the program. It happened on a Friday evening in what would have been winter if the building had been outside rather than in. The bay doors were closed against the cold. Someone had strung lights along the rafters, Marcus's wife LaShonda's contribution, practical and warm. Folding tables against the walls. Enough food to feed twice the people present. The kind of gathering that fills a space without being arranged. Every mechanic was there. All 3 apprentices. Patricia, who had changed into a different blouse from her work shirt, but kept the same expression of calibrated observation she wore in every professional setting. Deshaun, Darius's friend from outside the company, who had driven 40 minutes because Darius had called him and simply said, "Come." Miss Gloria, who had kept Amara on 100 late evenings, and who arrived with a dish covered in foil that she handed to LaShonda with the authority of a woman who expected it to be placed in a position of honor on the table. And Amara, who was 9 now, who wore her good sneakers and stayed close to her father's side for the first hour, and then gradually, inevitably, migrated toward Jerome, who had become something between a big brother and a favorite uncle in the vocabulary of her life. Victoria arrived last. Not late, she had timed it deliberately. She had learned something in 6 months about when a room belonged to the people in it, and when a CEO's presence organized the space in ways that changed what people felt free to do. She had learned to wait until the gathering was established before she walked in. When she did, Darius met her at the door. He hadn't planned to. He'd been across the bay talking to Tony. But he'd seen her come in, and he'd walked over, and the deliberateness of that movement, not required, not performed, simply chosen, said something that neither of them put into words. "Good turnout," she said. "They're good people." She looked around this bay. At the lights LaShonda had strung. At Jerome crouched down showing Amara something on his phone, probably the diagnostic app Darius had been teaching him. At Tony and Marcus's kid Marcus Jr., in what appeared to be an extremely serious conversation about something that made Marcus Jr. nod repeatedly with the expression of a young person absorbing information they planned to use. "6 months ago I stood in the middle of this bay," Victoria said, "and said things that I thought were business decisions. I thought I was being strategic." She paused. "I was being blind." Darius didn't argue with it or soften it. "You were." "I know." She looked at him directly. "I want to say something tonight, to everyone. And I want to ask your permission first, because this is your room more than it is mine, and I understand that now." He looked at her for a moment. "Say the real thing," he said. "Not the version that makes you look like you handled it well. The version where you didn't." "That's what I planned." "Then say it." The gathering moved with its own rhythm for another hour. Food disappeared. Conversations overlapped. Laughter moved through the space in waves, the kind that starts somewhere specific and spreads because the mood is right and the people trust each other enough to let it. Ryan Hayes stood near the secondary bench talking to Patricia. Darius watched them from across the... Not obviously the way you watch things you're curious about without wanting to make them self-conscious. Patricia was talking with her hands, which she did when she was engaged and not managing. Ryan was listening with his whole body the way he'd learned to listen in the last 6 months, without the defensive half-presence he'd had when he arrived. Deshaun materialized at Darius's elbow. That him, the nephew. That's him. Deshaun studied Ryan for a moment. He looks different than I expected. Different how? Less certain of himself. Deshaun tilted his head. In a good way. Like he found out the world was bigger than he thought and decided to get curious about it instead of threatened. Darius looked at his friend. That's a generous read. I'm a generous man. Deshaun glanced at him. You believe it? Darius was quiet for a moment. I believe he's doing the work. I believe that's real. Whether it lasts past the point where it stops being uncomfortable. He paused. That's the part nobody knows yet. But you gave him the room to find out. That's all anybody can do. Deshaun nodded slowly. Your uncle would have liked this, he said. What you've built here. Darius looked around the bay. At the people in it. At the lights strung along the rafters that turned the industrial space into something that felt for this one evening like it had a heart. I think about him a lot, Darius said. In here. I know you do. He gave me a toolbox and told me to do the work so well they couldn't pretend I wasn't there. He paused. I've been trying to figure out for 20 years if I've lived up to that. Deshaun looked at him with the directness of a man who had known him since they were teenagers and had no patience for false modesty or unnecessary suffering. Look at this room. Look at what's in it. What do you think? Darius looked. Jerome showing his daughter something on a phone. Marcus laughing at something Tony said. 3 apprentices in the corner talking among themselves with the specific energy of people who have realized they're learning something worth learning. Patricia unbuttoned one notch from her professional baseline, telling Ryan a story that was making him laugh, a real laugh, not a social one. Miss Gloria holding court near the food table, having located LaShonda, and formed an immediate alliance based, as far as Darius could tell, on the shared conviction that everyone in the room needed to eat more. Victoria Hayes, standing near the far wall, watching all of it, with an expression he had come to recognize over 6 months. The expression of a woman who was learning to see what had always been in front of her. Yeah, Darius said. That was all. Just yeah. It was enough. Victoria spoke near the end of the evening. She didn't make a production of it. She just moved to a spot where she could see most of the room, and when she started speaking, the conversations around her gradually quieted the way sound quiets when people sense something real is being said. I want to talk about what happened 6 months ago, she said. Not the business impact, not the resolution, the decision itself. She looked around the room. I made a decision that told every person in this building something about what I valued. I didn't intend it that way, but intention doesn't determine impact. What I did said, the person who built this, who trained you, who carried this company through situations most of you saw, and I only read about after the fact, that person matters less than a family name. The room was quiet. That was wrong, specifically wrong. And I want to be specific about why, because general apologies are easy and specific ones are the only kind that mean anything. She paused. I looked at Darius Coleman, and I saw output. I saw numbers. I saw what the department produced. I did not see the man. I did not see what it had cost him, what it costs every person in this room to show up and do excellent work in a place that wasn't always structured to recognize it. Another pause. I also made assumptions about him that I would not have made about someone who looked different or came from a different background. I am not going to dress that up or qualify it. That is what happened, and I own it fully. She looked at Darius. You told me something in your driveway. You said a title can be given. Respect has to be earned. She held his gaze. I have spent 6 months trying to earn it. I don't know if I have. That's not for me to decide. She looked back at the room. What I can tell you is that this building, the way it operates, the way it values people, the way it decides who advances, and why it is going to reflect what Darius built here. Not what I walked in thinking I was going to build, what was already here, what he made. She stopped. That's all I wanted to say. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Marcus started clapping. It wasn't a big sound at first, just his hands, that specific, deliberate applause of a man who means it rather than performs it. Then Jerome. Then Tony, who was looking at the ceiling again with his jaw set. Then the room in the overlapping genuine way of people who were not following a social cue but responding to something true. Darius stood at the edge of it. He didn't move to the center. He didn't speak. He let it be what it was without making it about himself, because that was who he was and had always been the person at the edge of the recognition present, without needing to occupy the middle of it. Amara found him. She was 9 years old, and she had been watching everything with the careful attention of a child who understands that something important is happening and wants to remember it accurately. She pressed in against his side. He put his arm around her without looking down. "Daddy," she said quietly. Just that. His name, his title, the one that mattered most. "I know," he said. She leaned into him, and Darius Coleman stood in the garage that had almost let him go, surrounded by the men who had refused to let it, next to the daughter for whom he had done every hard thing he had ever done, and he felt the weight he had carried for 6 months, for 14 years, settle into something different, not gone. The weight never goes completely. That is the truth about carrying things that matter. They stay with you, but they change form when the work has been done right. They become something you can hold, rather than something that holds you. He had done the work right. The garage knew it. The men in it knew it. The clients who called and asked for him by name knew it. Victoria Hayes, standing across the room with something genuinely changed in her posture, knew it. And Amara, 9 years old, leaning against his side in a garage full of people who had chosen to stand, Amara knew it most of all. Not because she understood every detail of what had happened here, but because she had watched her father go through something hard without becoming someone smaller, and come out the other side with more people standing beside him than he'd had going in. That was the lesson she was going to carry. Not from a classroom. From a garage on a Friday evening with lights strung along the rafters, and the smell of engine oil and good food, and the particular sound of people who trust each other enough to be in the same room and mean it. The following Monday, Darius arrived at 7:50. He sat in his truck for his 30 seconds. He went inside. He opened his toolbox, ran his fingers along the organized rows, made contact, said what he always said with that gesture, "I'm here, we're starting." He pulled his work order clipboard off the hook. The bay was alive around him. Marcus at his station. Jerome focused and precise. The 3 apprentices in their positions learning. Ryan Hayes in the intake area with his documentation form, checking fluid levels on the first vehicle of the morning, with the careful attention of someone who had learned slowly and at real cost that the small thing done well was the foundation of everything else. Darius looked at the work order in his hand. Jensen Trucking, full fleet inspection, due by 4. He walked toward the lift. Marcus fell into step beside him for a few strides, the way he did sometimes, not to say anything particular, just to be in proximity, the way men who have worked together long enough don't always need words to be in conversation. "Good morning," Marcus said. "Good morning," Darius said. They walked. The bay moved around them, its sound, its rhythm, its living weight of people doing real work for real reasons. The sound of a place that knew what it was and who had built it and why it was worth showing up for every morning. Darius reached his lift, checked his clipboard, got his hands ready. He thought briefly of his uncle. Do it so well they can't pretend you weren't there. He looked at the truck on the lift, at the work in front of him, at the 14 years of mornings that had led to this one, and the mornings still ahead, each one a choice, and each choice a building block of something that would outlast the choice itself. Then he got to work. Because that was what he had always done. Because that was who he was. Because a man who knows his worth doesn't need a title to prove it. He just needs a lift, a toolbox, and the willingness to show up and do the thing that only he can do, the way that only he can do it, every single day, without apology, without exception.